It's up to you. Some students probably learn better while coding along. Some students learn better by just watching. So yeah, it's whatever you feel like is your best style. Yeah.
Just for the milestones, are we going to be doing like checking them in class?
Yes, you got it. Yeah, it'll be all in class. And what I'm going to try to do is come up with a classroom calendar so that you'll always know like which classes are going to be milestone checks, which ones will be lectures, and what actually those lectures will be about. So I expect to have that done this week as well. Okay, so Active Admin is a gem that you will likely be using on your project. It's up on GitHub. It's an open source project. It also has a website with documentation. So we'll follow through some of that documentation today to get it set up. And I'm going to start by creating a new Rails project, a very simple one. Rails new, I'm going to call it the Little Schoolhouse. And we're going to have, at least initially, just 2 models in this project. There's going to be a student model and a school model, and those things are going to be associated with each other. There's going to be a one-to-many association between students and schools, in that a student is going to belong to a school, and a school will have many students. So I will head over here to the Little Schoolhouse. I'll add everything to Git, and I will commit the initial vanilla Rails project. Good. So first thing first, I want that model, or those models. I want to do Rails G for generate, a model for a student, and the student is going to have a name, which is a string, and a student number, which is also a string. You might be tempted to create a student number as a number, but are you ever going to do math with a student number? And do some student numbers start with the number 0? Do all of your student numbers start with the number 0?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you probably don't want that to go away, right? It might have some meaning in terms of the student number, I don't know. So I tend to make things like student numbers as strings because they're not really numbers. They're numeric, but they're not numbers that we're going to do calculations on. They're like, yeah, numeric. They're identifiers, but they're not really mathy numbers. That's my student model. School is going to be even simpler. A school is simply going to have a name. And then I can do a Rails DB migrate to bring the 2 associated tables into existence, because each one of them created a migration. So we have that one and that one. So by running Rails DB migrate, I will get a students table and a schools table. Like so. Then I can git add and git commit, added the school and student models.
Didn't have a hotkey for git commit, eh? Seems like you type that sentence like a million times.
A lot of people will do aliases. I had a bunch of aliases on one of the servers that I was working with when I was doing some active Rails development, where like GC would be git commit. So a lot of people do that, so they alias their common patterns. There's even a way to do like the add and the commit in sort of one go. I think it's like -am or something like that. What was the model for student? Student simply has a name string and a student number string. But you're right, you do end up typing those a lot, so there's different ways to deal with that. You can do aliases. Some people just bring in plugins into their editor, so there's some nice Atom plugins. Yeah, there's ways to deal with it. Okay, so now that I have those 2 models, I want to bring in Active Admin as a way to manage those models in the back end. What I'd like to be able to do is to have some administrator have an account where there's a username and password, where they're going to have to provide that username and password in order to get access to the CRUD for these models. So when we were doing Rails projects that had CRUD earlier on this course, if we were to deploy those projects, anyone that went to the website would have access to the CRUD. And that's not always what we want, right? It's what you want if you're building something like Wikipedia, maybe, but for, you know, a website where you want only admins to have CRUD access to certain models, you want a way to authenticate those admins. And ActiveAdmin is going to provide that authentication. It does that by way of another gem called Devise, and it's also going to provide pre-built CRUD for all of our models. So how you add ActiveAdmin is how you add most gems to a gem project or gem-based project in Ruby, which is editing the gem file. And in the documentation here, they give you the line that they want you to add. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to go to my project here, and I'm going to open up the gem file. So Rails is already in and of itself built of a number of gems, and they're all listed in here. All of these gems will be loaded in any one of Rails' 3 modes. So we have development mode, production mode, and test mode. Down below, though, there are subsections for gems that are loaded only in development and test, and gems that are loaded only in development. You can also make a group for, say you needed a gem that was only needed in production. I'm going to put a little comment down here, project specific gems, and this is where I'm going to add gems that are specific to my project. And I'm going to save that. Most of these gems are being pulled down from the Ruby Gems server. This gem is different in that I specified that I want the gem to be pulled directly from GitHub. So Git will be used to pull this gem down instead of being pulled from the Ruby Gems server. Some gems like this style because then you're always pulling the latest master off of GitHub. So for a gem that's under heavy development, as long as they're keeping that latest master so that it's passing all tests, you can feel fairly confident to go to GitHub to grab the gem. Other gems you might only grab to the Ruby Gem server because there's a publishing process that goes on there. So you're sort of a little bit more certain that you're only going to have gems that are ready for usage that are going to be published. So, yeah, go ahead.
A little off topic, but like this practice in an open source community, kind of pulling data all the time. You ever had it really botched projects?
Yes, guaranteed. So I have a project right now that I built where I'm using a version, sort of a branched version of ActiveAdmin, and the last time I tried to get that project up and running, I fought with it for a few hours and I never got it up and running. And then I was like, abandon ship. So the change that I wanted to make to that project, I was just like, yeah, I guess I'm not making that change right now. And thankfully it was something minor, and it was like a pet project of mine, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But yes, you can end up in what like people call sort of dependency hell, which is like one dependency needs to be at this particular version, but when you pull that version in, you need another sub-dependency that's at another particular version, but maybe you have another gem that needs that third-party dependency at yet a different version, and you can end up chasing those.
Yeah, like that dependency I just meant like get like CRUD in your database.
Oh, and yes, that can also happen too. So like some people, even with like...
Someone pushing like a really bad version.
Yes, and so that's why you do things like this. Like notice Rails and some of these other gems are locked. And so what this squiggly lock is like it's going to allow anything in the 5.1x category. So it'll allow 5.1.5 and 5.1.6, but it won't allow 5.2 into the system. So you tend to, for certain gems, sort of lock them at particular versions or subversions, and then you can later go in and maybe I'm going to go and audit all my gems and say, let's see if I can bring them all up to the latest greatest. I'll branch in Git before I do that, and then I'll go and sort of upgrade all my gems and see if anything breaks. That tends to happen every once in a while. Let's say like Rails hits another major version. That's a time when people will go and sort of look at all their gems, because they're going to be spending a bunch of time getting their app to run on the next version of Rails, which is usually a bit of a hassle. And then so if they're going to be putting in that hassle, they might as well go and do that to all of their gems. The other thing I had a quick discussion with the other section about was just this whole idea of like building projects based not entirely on other people's code, but based a lot on other people's code. This idea of like curating a set of gems and that becoming your project, and what that means for your project. And what it often means is that you don't understand all of what's actually in your project, and you're letting in a lot of third-party code that could have security holes, that could have, just have problems in it. And it's not just your first sort of line gems. So every gem that's listed in this file has sub-dependencies. And if we look at this lock file shows all of the gems and all of those gems dependencies. So this is really the list of gems that's going into our project. Like, that's a lot. And that's just Rails on its own.
But you know what all those do, right?
Oh, of course. And so this is problematic, but this is the way that a lot of software is written these days. If you're writing software in the Ruby community, it's very gem oriented. If you're writing software in the Node JavaScript community, it's very NPM oriented. Yeah.
So, I mean, you have a lot of these gems, and there's a massive amount of these that you'll never use in this particular project. Like, you'll never even access them. So, is there not a benefit to not running like this Rails generating project, but starting a project from scratch where you can manage your own dependencies right from the very first?
Maybe, but a lot of them you're actually using and not realizing it. Like, they are just Rails.
Well, I think I saw CoffeeScript in there somewhere.
Yes, and so for those, you can actually go in and like, some people will go in and like just turn full gems off. So like, oh, I'm not going to use CoffeeScript. Like, I would just remove it from my gem file. Yeah, so there is some room for doing that, sort of like making sure that you're not pulling in things that you're never going to use. Yeah, for sure. And the other story I shared with the other group was just this, I think it was about 2 summers ago, it was in the Node world, where like a lot of Node-based websites went down for a day when a particular developer pulled his library from the NPM package management system. It was a library called leftpad. And all it did was add left padding to the front of strings. But all sorts of gems were, or all sorts, not gems in that community, all sorts of libraries were dependent on leftpad. And there was this bit of a fiasco. The author of leftpad had created another library that a company wanted that same library name, and the Node package management people gave that name. They took it from this developer and gave it to the company because it was their trademark. And then this author got very upset and said, well, I'm pulling all of my libraries from NPM. And then all of these websites that had sort of auto-build scripts that were auto-building their website like daily based on NPM packages, they all went down because leftpad was missing and everything depended on leftpad.
So there's something like Angular, Node has a feature called tree shaking.
Yeah.
So you go to compile your code down and you're packaging everything up. It shakes the tree loose, and it'll get rid of things like coffee rails and things like that, things that you don't actually use, so that as a developer you can add in all the fluff you want, and then
yes.
you change your mind halfway through, but you never took out those dependencies. They don't actually get packaged into the final product. Does Rails do the same thing or similar?
It's almost, I'm impressed that tree shaking's even possible in a dynamic language like JavaScript. I would say it's next to impossible in an uber dynamic language like Ruby. There's really almost no way to statically analyze Ruby code to know for certain what is being used and what isn't being used. That's one of the problems with having such a dynamic language, is that we just cannot do that kind of tree shaking. Okay, so that's all of a little bit of an aside, but it's important to know, like, this whole course is full stack web development, and a lot about being a full stack web developer is taking on other people's dependencies and sort of the risks associated with that, whether they're risks like your whole project comes crashing down because of leftpad, or whether there's security risks. There are companies out there that will actively manage your lock file for you. You could be uploading your lock file to these companies on a regular basis by way of a server, and it will then send you alerts when some of the gems have security holes in them. So it'll sort of manage that for you, and you get a ping saying, okay, you know, the active support gem currently has a security hole in the version that you're using. You better update that ASAP. So there's services out there that do this kind of thing, and there's also gems. There's a gem called Brakeman that will audit your gem file for you, and it's an open source product. Yep.
So if we remove a gem, do we have to do like a bundle install to actually remove it, or?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I think typically what I do is run bundle install after removing a gem, but I'm not exactly sure if that quote unquote removes it or not. You have to do that with Angular. You sort of rerun. Yeah, it doesn't actually remove it. And removing it from your gem file, it'll still be on your system, right? It'll still be one of the gems in the system. You could then go and run the gem command, like gem uninstall gem name, and then it would really be gone from your system. Okay, cool. So that was a bit of an aside, but we've now got this active admin in our gem file, but we still need to run bundle install. So that runs bundler, which is what manages our gem file for us, and you can see now bundler is grabbing active admin. In the list that pops up, anything that appears in green is going to be a new dependency, but I ran this already once today, and so we don't get to see that. But when I ran it with the other group, it was like from adding that one line, there was a good, let's say 10 gems that were added to the system. And just saying that aloud triggered the fact that I actually need one more gem in here that I forgot, which is devise. Devise is an authentication gem. It's what ActiveAdmin uses to provide username password authentication, but ActiveAdmin doesn't assume that you want that. You need to specify, okay, I do want the devise component to be part of it, and then ActiveAdmin can then use that to manage your usernames and passwords.
Sorry, I might have missed the clarification. Is ActiveAdmin front and back end, or is it back end?
Just back end.
Just back end.
And so devise ActiveAdmin, and now I'll run this bundle install again. That'll bring devise into my system. So if you're coding along with me, that process probably would have taken a little bit longer because it would have had to download a lot of those new gems. Okay, now that ActiveAdmin is part of our system, I can go back to the ActiveAdmin docs, and I can see that when we add ActiveAdmin to the system, it adds a new generator for me. So we've done things like Rails generate model and Rails generate scaffold, and now we have a Rails generate ActiveAdmin install. So I'm going to run that. Rails G ActiveAdmin :install. So active_admin :install. That creates some migrations, it adds some models, it puts a whole new folder in our app folder. So we now have an app/admin folder that we're going to be making use of throughout today's class. And because it added migrations, then I need to run those migrations with a Rails DB migrate. It also added JavaScript and CSS to our assets folder. So I can add that, added ActiveAdmin and ran the install generator. And then the last thing that I want to do is I want to make ActiveAdmin aware of the different resources that I want it to manage. And so there's two of them, there's student and school. And so I can say Rails generate, and it's ActiveAdmin resource that I want to generate. So Rails G active_admin resource. And I want Rails to manage my student model for me. Sorry, I want ActiveAdmin to manage my student model for me. And I want ActiveAdmin to manage my school model for me. And if you notice, what happens there is we get a new file put into that new AppAdmin folder. So there is an AppAdmin students and an AppAdmin schools in there. And I have to edit those. So this is some of the setup work that I need to do to get ActiveAdmin working. close that, and app, here's that admin folder, and I want to open up the students and the schools. In each one of them, we have a do end block where active admin is registering that it's going to be managing a school and a student. And then we have these comments that are going to tell us a bit about what we need to do in here. We need to provide a whitelist of the parameters of our model that we wish active admin to be able to edit. And so if you watched the video that I made on creation, we had to go through that whole idea of permitting certain parameters by way of the params hash to avoid mass assignment attacks. Well, here we have to whitelist particular parameters to allow active admin to use them. So I have to say permit params, and for students, I want active admin to be able to edit the name and the student number. And then I can remove these extra comments. So it's just permit underscore params, name as a symbol, comma, student number as a symbol. And for the school, it is permit params and just the name. And then that's all the setup work that I need to do. And so if I run my server, should be able to go to my local host. That's just the you're welcome to Rails message, right? We don't yet have any controllers of our own. But if we go to /admin, we're going to be prompted for a username and password. But we don't yet have a username and password. Yeah, it's slow the first time you use it. So if we look here while it's loading up, one of the other things that ActiveAdmin has added for us is in the DB folder. If we look at our seeds, which is where we put in seed data for our various databases, we have this line added in where ActiveAdmin is, when we run the seed script, ActiveAdmin will create a user for us with an email address of admin@example.com and a password of password. So we can edit that and change those defaults. They handily make sure that that default user never gets made in production, right? Because you wouldn't want to accidentally run your seed script and put in this generic username and password into your production database. So they thankfully put that little catch for us. So if I go over here, here's my login page. That's not going to run yet, right? Because I didn't run my seed script yet. And so I'll just kill my server and I'll run that seed script. DB seed.
Server's lives matter.
Do you even have to create a users table that creates a port?
You're right.
And then I guess there's no extend the users table, like what are the default fields? Is it just the email and username that it creates?
I'll show you. Yeah, so it uses a users table. I tend to leave that table alone and have it just be for ActiveAdmin, but then I tend to repurpose devise, which is already in my system. And if I need like some other kind of, maybe say like if I needed customers to have their own logins, I would create like a customers table and have username and password stored separately in there. But that's, I mean, you could also, you could repurpose the table if you wanted to. It's not that complex of a table. So there's my seed script has been run. One thing I haven't done yet, which is sort of secondary to what we've been working on, but will prevent me or allow me to not have to restart my server over and over again, is those little tweaks that we can make to the config environments file so that when we make changes to our code in our shared folder, those changes are going to actually be reflected. And how do we do that? That is in, I think I just posted it up here. So we need to add this line right here to that file. I'll add it down at the bottom here, which is reload classes only on change false, and this goes from the evented file update checker just to the file update checker. Now I can have my server running without having to restart it all the time. And I'll run that server. Okay, back over here, just going to reload to make sure that there's no errors in loading up this login form. And then I'll be able to log in with admin@example.com and a password of password. And this is what ActiveAdmin looks like. Up top here, I see the various resources that I'm allowed to edit, so we can see what an admin user looks like. An admin user has an email address, an ID, currently signed in at, sign-in count, and a created column. And then here are the two resources that I asked ActiveAdmin to manage for me. There's currently no information in there, but I can go and, for example, create a new school, like Red River College, and have that actually create and show in my list of schools. And I can also do things like I can add validations to my various models and have ActiveAdmin enforce those validations for me. So if I go into my models folder and pull up my school and my student, I might make it so that a school that we validate that the name has a presence of true, and that with a student, not only the name has the presence of true, but also the student number. And so by adding those validations into those two models, I should be able to go over here. If I try to create a new school that does not have a name, it tells me that the name can't be blank. So it's following my validations now, and I can add University of Brandon to the mix. And so now I have 2 schools in my list. I can also create students. Had presence validations on both the name and the student number. You know, those get keyed in, and then we can have Wally Glutton created as a student. So it's as simple as that for our basic kinds of CRUD, right? I created the models, I brought ActiveAdmin into the project, and then I registered those resources with ActiveAdmin. There's one other thing I might like to do, is that there should be an association between these two models. Like a student should belong to a school, and a school should have many students. And so what do I need to do in terms of that? Well, not too much in terms of ActiveAdmin, but I have to do some foreign key management in my database, right? In order for there to be a relationship between a student and a school, I need there to be a foreign key inside of my student table. So inside of my student table, I should have a school ID that references which school this student belongs to. In my models, I'm also going to have to set up the associations there. So I'll leave my server running, and I'll open up another commander here where I can SSH into my server, and I can make those changes happen. And I'll also do a git add. So Vagrant, Rails, Little Schoolhouse, So the validations have been added. Okay. Git add config environment, git commit, modify the dev env such that the server need to be restarted, and then git add whitelisted the active admin params and added validations to the models. Okay, so Git's nice and clean. So I need to add a new column to a table. And so I don't go and directly start editing that table. I'm going to do this change by way of a migration. So everything we do that modifies the database in any way in Rails should be captured in a migration. And that way our Git history is also going to include a history of all the changes that are made to my database over time. And if I ever need to step backwards in time to an older version of the code, I can also step backwards in time to an older version of the database by rolling my migrations back one by one. Rails gives you that permission or that ability when you do everything by way of migrations. It's a very, very nice thing. Having worked on a lot of large-scale database applications, without something like migrations, if you're on a big team, your dev environments can get out of sync really fast, and migrations give you a way to sort of guarantee that you're in sync with all of your fellow workers. Okay.
Also, if you have to recreate the database,
yes.
That's captured in code.
It's captured in code, and it is captured in the schema.rb file as well. So you can either, for a large Rails application, you can either have it run through every single migration, or you can have it pull in the database as is sort of snapshotted in the final schema as well. There's a couple different ways we can make migrations. There's a whole guide on migrations. So if you go to guides.rubyonrails.org, there is a migration guide. There are generators for migrations, so we could do a Rails G migration and give it a name, and then edit that migration to describe the changes we needed to be made. But there's also certain migrations that are so common that if we do our migration command and we name things in just the right way, it'll write the migration for us. So the common things that we're doing with migrations are adding columns to database tables and adding references to database tables. And a reference here, I mean like a foreign key reference, what we're right about to do. So I'm going to write this out in the sort of standard way that you would write this, and it's a Rails convention. And if you follow this convention, it'll make the correct migration for us. So in camel case, I write add, and then it's a school ref to students. And so whenever we're writing a migration, we always write it out as add. What are we adding? We're adding a reference to a school. So we write the thing that we're referencing, then the word ref, then the word to, and then the table that we're changing. And it's the students table. And then we have to specify that we're adding a school and it's of type references. So whenever you're making a migration, like when we do a Rails G model, we have our different data types. So we say string, or we say text, or we say integer. References is the data type that Rails uses to refer to foreign key references. And so in the database, it's actually going to become an indexed integer. But we just say references here.
You could have done this when you created the school model.
Yes, yeah. I just wanted to demo the migration. But yes, I definitely could have done it up front.
Is this going to create the code in the model like we were doing references before, where it's like depends on
Oh, the has many. If we had done it up front when we did the model, it does one of the two sides for you. But no, we'll have to add that in because we're doing it after the fact. So I'll run this. That builds this migration for me. We can go take a look at that migration. It's in the DB migrate folder. It's this add school ref to students migration. And so really it's so short that we could have just written this ourselves. We could have done a Rails G migration and named the migration, and then we would have been presented with a migration file that had an empty change method in it. And we could have added to it. Add reference, what are we adding the reference to? It's the students table. It's a reference to what? It's a reference to a school, and it is a foreign key. So we could have written that ourselves, but because I crafted the command line in such a way, this was written for us. And I can now run this with a Rails
Did you
DB
create the
migrate.
one-to-many yet?
I haven't yet in code defined the one-to-many yet. Rails DB migrate, that'll run the migration for us. And if we want to take a peek at to what actually happened there, we can look in the DB folder at the schema.rb. That's always the sort of the code equivalent of our current schema. And if we look down in the student section, we can see that now our school ID is present in the students table as an integer, which is indexed. Then over here, I can tell the student class, so this is my app model student.rb file. I can say that a student belongs to a school. And whenever I reference something here, it's always lowercase. The keys in Rails are almost always exclusively lowercase. And I belong to a single school, so it's school singular. A student belongs to a school. What this means is that there is a school ID integer key in the schools table. And over at the school model, which is the app models school.rb file, I will say that a school has many students, plural, because it's a one-to-many association. So I've set my association up. A student belongs to a school, and a school has many students. Close the migrations up. I also have to go to my app admin folder, and in the students RB file, I need to whitelist the school ID property as well. So active admin needs to know, or needs to have permission to set school IDs for me. So those are the three changes. The belongs to school in the student model, that has many students in the school model, and then in the students.rb app admin file, we whitelisted that, the school ID. With all that done, I can hop back over to my actual website, which is right here. I can edit this existing student. Here's Wally Glutton. Edit student Wally Glutton. And now in the form that's presented for a student, both for creating and updating, I get a drop down where active admin knows about the relationship by way of the model, so it automatically goes to the school model, pulls down all schools, makes a drop down for me of the available schools, and I can say, well, Wally Glutton goes to Red River College and update. Same thing goes when I create a new student. So if I go back to the student section and I create a new student, I get the same drop down, so that like Daisy Glutton goes to University of Brandon. And then you can see on that individual student's page, you also get a link directly to their associated school. And you can follow through to that to get to the school page. And active admin also allows us to comment on any resource and any row within any resource table if your admins need to do that.
So if you wanted to add like another table, it's like classrooms.
Yeah.
It'd just be a matter of making the model and doing a migration.
You got it.
And then you would be able to.
Model migration, then you'd have to register that resource with ActiveAdmin. So you'd have to do that ActiveAdmin registration step, and then you'd have to whitelist the parameters. So there's a few things, but not too many. Yeah.
It knows right away, even though you whitelist the ID, that you want to edit it by name.
Yes, and so it picks that up because it looks at the models and sees the has many and belongs tos. And so the whitelist only matters at save time. So it only cares, like, if I didn't have this in here, at save time, an error would be thrown. It would still present the same nice little drop down, but at save time an error would be thrown because it would not have permission to write the student ID. But it knows about making the drop down because of the fact that student has a belongs to.
No, but I mean that it knows that you want the name and not the actual ID number.
Oh, yes, yeah.
If
And
you wanted to edit the ID, like what if it was the student ID that you were pulling from the drop down? You wanted to get the actual student ID and not.
if you had named it student ID, your column. One thing is that in the Rails world, you should never name anything. That's one of those like unspoken rules. Is
Never edit the keys correctly.
yes, and you should never name anything _ID if it's not actually going to be a foreign key reference, because that's sort of Rails speak for this is a foreign key. But yeah, that's one of the dangers of this whole conventions over configurations thing, is you can accidentally trip a convention by things like naming it _ID. But you're right, yeah, it knows automatically that that's what you want to set is the ID, not the actual anything
Well,
else.
that's what I know, because that's why part of that's funny is that it gets the name, like the string name.
Oh, yeah. And it looks automatically for something called name or title. And if you don't have those things, then you just see that sort of like when when you puts out a object and you get that hash reference. Yeah. So if you ever see that in one of your drop downs, it means like you've made a model that doesn't have either a name or a title column, because that's what ActiveAdmin guesses on, that it's either name or title. And what you do then is inside of, like, say I had something in here where it wasn't called name, it was called like school name. I could make what's called a virtual attribute, which is just like making a method, giving it the name, and then like mapping it to the actual column like that, and then ActiveAdmin would call this method to populate that
And you
that
can
drop
use that in
down.
your code.
Yeah, you could use that in your code too. So yeah, I see what you're getting at. How did it know to use the name? And so yeah, it defaults to either the word name or the word title.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could override that.
And you can, yeah. And so I think that's all I got for you for today. So I will capture this to Git add commit -m added the association between school and student.
No, there is. It's not. Oh, 38.